In Ravenport City, the police served whoever paid them, and politicians bowed to men who never appeared on camera. But even in a city built on corruption, one name carried more weight than law itself: the Valentis. They ruled the streets with silence, shadows, and fear, until a single betrayal turned their world upside down and gave birth to the most dangerous man Ravenport had ever seen. The story begins on a warm evening in 1947. Music filled the streets outside a grand hall where Don Alessandro Valenti celebrated his daughter's wedding. Inside, men in suits lined up to greet him: judges, businessmen, politicians. All came not just for the bride, but to bow before the man who controlled half the city. At the head of the table, Alessandro smiled. He was the picture of power, calm, respected, untouchable. Yet in the corner, his youngest son, Marco Valenti, sat quietly, watching. Marco had no interest in the family's empire. He was a soldier returning from war, a man who believed in honor, not blood money. To him, his father's world was a prison of shadows. But Ravenport had no room for men who stood aside. Not long after the wedding, a rival gang struck a fatal blow. Enzo Valenti, Alessandro's eldest son and heir, was ambushed. His body was left bleeding in the streets as a message: the Valentis were no longer untouchable. Alessandro tried to hold his empire together, but whispers spread. The Don was aging, his grip slipping. For the first time in decades, his enemies smelled blood. Weeks later, assassins made another move. Gunfire echoed through Ravenport as Alessandro's car was ambushed. The Don survived barely, but the once feared patriarch now lay bedridden, his empire hanging by a thread. Rival families circled like wolves, waiting for the kill. And inside the Valenti home, Alessandro's sons argued. The hot-headed Santino wanted war. The calm and calculating Vincenzo urged patience. But Marco, the outsider, said nothing. He had always sworn never to enter this life. Until the night, he couldn't ignore it anymore. With his father weak and the family splintering, Marco faced a choice: stand aside and watch the Valentis collapse, or step into the shadows he once despised. His decision came swiftly, and it came with blood. Marco orchestrated a brutal counterattack, eliminating every man involved in his father's ambush. The city woke the next morning to whispers of horror. Marco Valenti, the quiet son, the soldier who wanted no part in crime, had just declared war. From that moment on, Marco was no longer just a son. He became a strategist, a predator. He made alliances no one thought possible, bribed judges his father had never dared to approach, and turned rivals against each other with whispers and false promises. His methods were colder, sharper, more ruthless than Alessandro's ever were. Friends became pawns, loyalty became currency, and betrayal became inevitable. His brothers watched in silence as Marco built an empire not on respect, but on fear. By the time Don Alessandro drew his final breath, the torch was no longer passed down. Marco had already seized it. The empire was his. Ravenport belonged to him. The once reluctant son had transformed into something the city had never seen before: a king in the shadows, ruthless and untouchable. But power always comes with a cost. Marco's rise had been swift, but the higher he climbed, the more enemies he made. Old rivals began plotting in silence. Friends who once toasted to his victories now sharpened knives behind his back. Even his own blood, his brothers, started questioning his rule. And the woman he loved? She begged him to walk away before it was too late. But Marco didn't listen. And what happened next would plunge Ravenport into its darkest chapter yet. This is only the beginning. If you thought Marco's rise was ruthless, wait until you see what he'll do to keep his crown. Subscribe now, because the war for Ravenport has only just begun.